Hey there, magical friends, ready to dive into another enchanting chapter of the Gretchens Misadventures series? You're in for a mystical treat. Today, we're venturing into the mesmerizing world of Psycho Mirror, Episode 5 in the Fractured Fairy Tale series by P.A. Mason. In this spellbinding tale, join us as we follow Gretchen on another misadventure where mystical mirrors and magical mayhem await. So grab a witch's brew and let's unveil the enchantment of Psycho Mirror. Psycho Mirror, Chapter 1. What do you mean I haven't paid? Gretchen flapped her arms in exasperation. The collectors were by just last week. I know I've been behind on my taxes most years, but this time I paid every last coin in full. The official's mouth turned up in a malevolent grin, his guards chuckling from their mounts outside her gate. You've paid none of your tithes to King Rupert of Extor. King who? Listen, buddy, I think you've gotten yourself turned around somewhere. This is Edgewater. We answer to King Edgar of Helgard. The answer brought raucous laughter from their party, and Gretchen glared at the lockbox strapped to one of their mounts. Good King Rupert has liberated these lands from the tyranny of Helgard. You owe fealty to him, and he has gone to great expense to rid your town of oppression. The official waved his hand in a flourish. Oppression? Gretchen blinked at the strange sigil stitched on his tabard. Well, when this Rupert of yours liberates my coin from King Edgar, he can have it. I don't believe for a minute that you ruffians are employed by any king. Just a bunch of bandits, I'll wager. If we were bandits, the official leered over her, we'd simply lock you in that hovel and set it alight. But our king is a lawful man, so if you refuse, we will arrest you for tax evasion. Gretchen opened her mouth to protest, then clicked her teeth shut. She wouldn't mind giving this fictitious monarch a piece of her mind, but she suspected those guards were itching for a bonfire. Give me a minute. She turned inside and ground her teeth when footsteps followed right behind her. While she was pretty sure she could deal with their little twerp, she wasn't so sure she could get rid of the burly men outside. It figured that she'd get robbed just as her fortunes had turned around, and paying double taxes meant she could kiss what little savings she had goodbye. If she could convince them to give her an extension, perhaps she could spend the difference on fortifying the place. It would be worth it just to see the look on there. Hurry up, woman, we don't have all day to watch you daydream. And don't you think about trying anything. The punishment for assault on tax collectors is suitably harsh. Gretchen huffed and took her pouch down from its hook. It won't be all of it. You hear? As it is, I'll eat nothing but beans for months. You know what they say about the greedy farmer who reaps more than he can sow. We'll be back at the end of the season. We've already agreed on terms with the mayor. Gretchen froze. The mayor? These guys had robbed an entire village? She thumbed through her gold stash and drew out 5 gold coins. When the official sneered, she produced another 5. And that much again when we return. He eyed her home with disdain. You witches might live like peasants, but I know a ruse when I see one. I'll have the accountant do a thorough inventory if I suspect you're holding back. He turned on his heel and marched out the door, leaving Gretchen to quietly seethe as he dropped her hard-earned gold in the lockbox and rode off. There was no way anyone was getting a glimpse of her inventory. She resolved to cash in on the taxes she'd paid the week before and demand some proper oversight by her liege lord. She noticed Mulligan still snoring on his tatty blanket by the hearth. Giving him a nudge with the toe of her boot, she scowled down at the feline. And what good were you? Supposed to be a witch's familiar. You could have given me a heads up. Mulligan stretched and yawned before blinking a few times. He stood, ignoring her ire, and wandered to his food dish to stare at it. Grumbling, Gretchen fetched him a hasty breakfast of entrails and dumped it in front of him. Should have gotten a dog. Darn thing would have at least barked when he heard him coming. Deciding against getting waylaid on the road, she grabbed her broom and checked the windows to be certain the thugs weren't lurking somewhere nearby. A quick stop in town just to be sure. But it was Nora who she needed to see. She doubted the Baron would grant her an audience, but as his witch in residence, Nora would know how to go about lodging some kind of grievance. Outside, she struggled to get her broom to cooperate. After launching down the muddy track a 3rd time, it gained enough momentum to carry her to the nearest bush, then firmly lodged itself in the tangle. "You're next, you hear?" she scolded it. Sorriest excuse for a witch's broom I've ever seen. Should have upgraded as soon as I had some coin to my name. I will not stand on sentiment any longer. Mark me, I'll splinter you for the fire just as soon as... Gretchen's backside hit the ground with a thud as she wrenched the broom free. Clearing her throat, she pushed herself to her feet and took measured breaths as she trod back down the path. "One more time, I dare ya." She gave the handle a shake for good measure and launched down the path, springing just in time as the broom gained velocity. The morning was a little windier than she preferred, and she clamped a hand to her hat to keep it from flying away. Her eyes watered as she picked up speed, and she glanced down at the trail of horses ambling along her lonely little lane. Her lip curled. She would have loved nothing more than smiting them from a height, but she pressed forward, soon passing them by toward the small township of Edgewater. It wasn't far as walks go, so she quickly arrived, turning circles to lower gradually. She saw a massed group in the town square and figured that was enough proof of what the official had said. Not liking her chances of another successful takeoff in her foul mood, she cleared the roof of one of the higher buildings and steered south toward the Salton Bog. Perhaps she should have started with the Baron's estate, but the chances were as good as any that Nora was still at their usual tavern from the night before. Besides, if she could give Jürgen a heads-up before the collectors arrived, it may avoid a brawl and having to stitch the troll up in the aftermath. Instead of cooling her hot head, the flight added to her irritation as the winds buffeted her from side to side. She narrowly avoided a lone bird flapping desperately to gain control of its trajectory and leaned forward to urge her broom onwards. When she arrived at the solitary establishment past the outskirts and less savoury industries outside the village, she skidded to a halt out back and left her broom wedged in the fence where it ended up. She stamped inside through the kitchens and onwards to the bar where Jürgen had a newspaper laid out. "Did they get you yet?" She sidled around and dropped to a stool. Jürgen didn't look up from the paper. "The thieves. They've hit the entire village. Some crap about being tax collectors from Exeter." The troll folded his newspaper carefully and looked up with a frown. "Been nobody but me here all morning." Gretchen glanced around the empty taproom and clucked her tongue. "Dang, I'd hoped Nora was here. I plan on giving that Baron a piece of my mind. Protection indeed. I paid my taxes just last week. Haven't seen her in weeks. I was thinking about checking in on her, but I haven't heard from the estate about the brandy order." He took a sip of coffee. "But if there's some kind of border dispute going on..." "Border dispute?" Gretchen screwed her face up. "I haven't seen a single soldier in these parts for years. They're crooks, taking advantage of a town too out of the way to bother with anything more than a sheriff and magistrate." "Probably just the start." Jürgen reached under the bar and pulled out a spiked club. He ran a tongue over his impressive canines and set it on the bar. "I'd like to see them try to get a single coin out of me." Gretchen opened her mouth to argue, but decided against it. He ran the tavern with an iron fist. If he knew how to handle the regulars, he'd do just fine with the bandits. She hoped he did anyway. "Well, I'd better fly over there and find out what's going on." Gretchen scraped her stool back, and Jürgen arched his eyebrow quizzically. "No coffee?" It was tempting, but even Jürgen's skill with coffee beans wouldn't appease the bee she had in her bonnet. "Maybe later. I'll let you know what's happening after I track her down." She left the nonplussed troll to the few hours of peace he enjoyed before the barflies started swarming and tramped back to the fence. Bracing her boot against the railing, she heaved her broom out and trod over to the dirt track. After 4 bungled attempts and a tender ankle, she was back in the air, fighting the wind pushing east from the estate. If there really was a border dispute going on, she had a mind to bang both kings' heads together and have them duke it out. There'd been peace on the continent for as long as Gretchen could remember, and the borders between realms had hardly changed from maps drawn centuries earlier. She knew King Edgar to be a man more interested in building than breaking, and didn't like his chances of waging a successful war campaign on anyone more formidable than the village fool. She couldn't complain, though. Taxes weren't all that high, and the collectors had come to accept that most years she needed more time to pay. Swooping toward the manor house, she thought about what the Baron was likely to do about all this. He was a keen hunter, but chasing down bandits wasn't something that needed doing regularly. She steered her broom behind the stables. She quickly learned not to leave any skids on the groundskeeper's pristine lawns, and gritted her teeth as she rolled clear, careful not to test her ankle. Stowing her broom in her infinity pouch, she limped through the quiet courtyard and down the steps that led to Nora's workroom. "Yoo-hoo!" She banged on the door. "You there, Nora?" She couldn't hear any scuffling behind the door and gave up after banging again. Pressing her lips together, she turned and hobbled up the steps toward the servants' entrance. The lack of lads outside and the empty hallways niggled at her, and as she stepped into the kitchens, Cook startled and held a hand to her chest. "What's going on around here? I'm looking for Nora." Cook regarded her with flighty eyes and nodded to a bench by the table that dominated the room. "Nora left weeks ago. The estate is now occupied by some lord of Extor." Chapter 2. "So, this is a thing? A border dispute?" Gretchen's mouth hung open and she sank to a bench. Cook's eyes darted and she pressed her lips together. "Best keep your voice down. We've been walking on eggshells all week." Gretchen turned to the empty hallway and wondered at the lack of maids scuttling past with bundles of laundry or buckets of water. This place looks deserted. Some of the young ones with families at home snuck off. Can't say I blame them. Us older folk don't have the same luxury. And now here we are at the beck and call of those ill-mannered louts. Said my stew wasn't fit for their dogs. She stirred a bowl of batter absently, her eyes glassy. "And the Baron?" Gretchen reached down to ease off her boot and probe her ankle. Must have had word, not that he'd tell us plebs. Took the whole family and more servants than he'd have use for, then left for the city 2 weeks ago. "Nora's in the city?" Cook's eyes sharpened and she grimaced. No, that affair was stranger still. Gretchen didn't press Cook as she fetched down a tea set and carried a kettle over from the hearth. After sliding a slice of apple cake under Gretchen's nose and settling to a seat, she cleared her throat and poured 2 cups. She had a delivery a few weeks ago. Not the usual sort. The cart that pulled in was bigger, and it took 2 men to carry the mirror down to her workroom. "Mirror?" Gretchen blinked. "Had a stump too." She stirred a lump of sugar into her tea. Tight-lipped about it she was, refused to discuss it even with the Baron himself. She was strange after that, thought it might even be some paramour, she snorted. But who in their right mind would give a woman with a face like that a mirror? Gretchen quirked an eyebrow and Cook rushed on. Anyhow, after a few days she wouldn't leave her workroom, snarled at anyone who knocked on the door. The last 2 trays I brought her went untouched. Then we found her door wide open one morning and she'd vanished, mirror and all. Gretchen took a sip from her cup and mulled it over. She'd been busy over the last few weeks catching up on orders at her stall in the city, and the last she'd heard from Nora was a note sent by one of her falcons. She had thought little of it at the time, but it seemed odd now. "So, nobody knows where she went?" "Not a word. And then the Baron flees the house and we're lumped with this lot." Cook sighed and cradled her cup in both hands. "Well," Gretchen set her tea down and stood, wincing at the weight on her leg. "Best I be off, then." "You didn't touch your cake," Cook tittered. "No time for that." Gretchen glanced down and scooped it in a napkin. After tucking it away in her pouch and pulling on her boot, she took one last gulp of her tea and nodded at her hostess. "Riddles to solve and kings to see." She hobbled off before Cook could reply and pulled her broom out as she made a beeline for the courtyard. Fetching Nora's note, she narrowed her eyes at the untidy scrawl and puzzled over the cryptic words. "We've been thinking about this all wrong. A witch queen is what we need." When it arrived, Gretchen had marvelled at how an inebriated Nora could have sent one of her birds in the right direction. A sinking feeling grew in the pit of her stomach. A good friend would have at least checked in to see if everything was okay. Scrunching the paper in her fist, she made for the stables, confusion taking over from outrage. Her ankle sided with outrage when she sprang off from the ground, though her broom was in better form and carried her into the air on the first attempt. The wind had ushered in a drizzle, and Gretchen silently cursed her friend for leading her on a goose chase in such inclement weather. Deciding on at least tending to her ankle before heading to the city, she headed back to the Salton Bog, looking forward to a hot cup of coffee and a good listener to talk the conundrum over with. But when she landed, Upturned barrels and half of the pots and pans littered the yard. "Jürgen," she called as she limped into the kitchen. Everything was a mess. Panic rising in her gut, she picked her way over the debris into the tap room. It was worse than what the regulars accomplished during an all-out brawl. Splintered chairs lay strewn across the hardwood floors, and a table perched precariously on the bar. Jürgen's club sat by the door, and Gretchen swallowed bile. She knew the troll wouldn't go down without a fight, but there had been enough of these extra men to do some serious damage. Thinking about him languishing away in some foreign dungeon made her forget about her ankle, and she fetched a bottle of brandy and took a deep swig. "Holy smokes!" Her breath came in ragged gasps. "I shouldn't have even bothered getting out of bed this morning." Considering her options, she tracked back to the kitchen, with the bottle still in hand, and dropped onto one of the few chairs remaining. First things first. She rummaged in her pouch for something to ease her ankle's swelling and took out a drying charm to take care of her damp clothes. A witch queen, mysterious mirror, and the peace broken among friendly nations, and 10 gold coins stolen straight from her pocket. Gretchen smeared ointment over her ankle and sighed as her clothes warmed. Not that it would do much good when she stepped out into the rain again. After letting the salve do its work and stowing her drying charm and the brandy away, she glanced out at the grey skies and drew a deep breath through her nose. I guess it's up to me to save the day again. She ruminated on the flight to the city and decided that King Edgar wouldn't dare refuse her an audience, but she had to decide which was the bigger problem to settle. Time was of the essence for Jürgen, and monarchs couldn't be trusted to consider the prisoners when it came time to sit at the negotiating table. And although Nora had been missing for weeks, Gretchen hoped she was just down in the library at the Witches' Academy, studying some obscure branch of magic. It wouldn't be the first time she'd become obsessed over a new concept. Her gut told her she needed to make a royal visit first. Instead of landing in her usual patch of the city, she continued to the castle courtyard and eyed the cobbles below askance. It would be just her luck to break her leg by the end of the day. As a wagon rolled in stacked with hay, she took the opportunity and sailed straight toward it. Despite hitting it a little harder than she'd like, it broke her fall, and she rolled over spluttering hay seeds and dust. "You there!" The clattering of guards drawing near drowned out the protests of the driver ahead of her. She should have expected that. "Keep your hands where we can see them, and climb down at once." "Don't mind me." Gretchen sat up slowly with her arms up. "Just needed someplace safe to land, on a mission of utmost importance, and I must see the king at once." Servants, city folk and guards alike gawked at her as she stood, then began laughing. "What?" She blew a stray strand out of her face. "Don't you fancy folks know there's a border war brewing out west?" Rough hands hauled her from the wagon, and the guard hissed at her to be silent. With a few shooing gestures, the crowd dispersed, leaving them to be glowered at by the wagon driver. "And who'll clean this up, then?" He waved at the mess on the cobbles. "I should break that broom and see how she likes it." "Go ahead," Gretchen muttered. "It'd probably break you first." "What's the meaning of this?" The guard's hand cut into her arm. "I told you. I want to see old King Eddie pronto." She thrust her chin up defiantly. "You can tell him if he turns me away. I'll start telling the story of how Prince Jacob really rescued his wife on every street corner." The guard's eyes searched hers, and he frowned as he nodded to his companion. "See what the captain says." Gretchen cried out as the guards dragged her away and beckoned to her broom, which stuck out from the haystack. Despite the love-loathe relationship they shared, she wouldn't want to find her way home without it. It jerked around before coming loose and slapping into her palm. The wagon driver made a vulgar gesture, and she stuck her tongue out in reply. She was frog-marched into the guard station by the gates and thrust down on a bench against the wall. As the guard kept a suspicious eye on her, Gretchen turned on a sardonic smile and opened her infinity pouch, stowing her broom away with deliberate slowness. Unable to look away, the guard's eyebrows climbed his forehead, and he turned his spear in his hand. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Chuckling, Gretchen leaned back and closed her eyes. The day felt like it had gone on forever, and she hoped she would wake as if from an awful dream. When the sound of boots crunching toward them roused her chaperone, She cracked one eye open. "Take her to the courts!" Frowning, she sat up and the guard rounded on her. "Looks like you've got your audience." The People's Courts, where magistrates usually presided over grievances, was very occasionally used for the king to officiate over disputes in his political favour. Technically part of the palace itself, its entrance was far less grand, and people milled around outside waiting for an audience. Gretchen wondered if they were seeking the same answers as her, but didn't have time to ask, as the guard cleared a path and a harried-looking official waved them in. Inside, the benches were empty, and the table on the dais was vacant of anyone, but a scribe bent over his work. "I thought you were taking me to him." Gretchen wrestled her elbow free. "His Majesty will be along when it suits him." The scribe's voice echoed down toward her, though he didn't bother to look up. The guard strode off, leaving Gretchen to gawk. Suspecting this was a ploy to get her off the street and out of the way, she strode to the front of the room and sank onto the closest bench. As the seconds rolled on in silence, she fetched Cook's apple cake and Jurgen's bottle of brandy from her pouch and chewed with her mouth open, staring at the scribe. She wondered what the official scribe of the realm was up to these days. She had a few choice words to say to him after reading his missive on her roll in the damsel gauntlet. The scribe in front of her did an admirable job, though, and didn't so much as flinch when she belched. Being ignored grated on her, and she stood and pulled up a seat beside him. "So, what can you tell me then? This border war, and the Baron running to the city with his tail between his legs. You write the words down." She tapped on the scroll in front of him. "I'll bet a fella like you has his finger on the pulse." "Get out of my chair!" a familiar voice boomed behind her. Gretchen stood and turned with her hands up. "No disrespect, Your Highness, just getting to know your scribe here is all." She backed away and stood at the edge of the dais, waiting for the king to take his seat. After settling his bulk down, he turned his glare to her and waved the scribe away. "What is this I hear of you making threats in my courtyard? Landing in a no-fly zone? Tell me why I shouldn't throw you in the dungeon." Gretchen smacked her lips and clapped her hands. "Well, maybe I got a little overzealous there. I have no intention of spilling the royal beans or anything, but what I have to tell you is of the utmost importance." "The problems in Greenhaven," he grunted. "You're a little late on that front." "Problems?" Gretchen screwed her face up. "They robbed me in my home just a week after paying my dues to your people. They have arrested my friend for refusing to hand anything over." There was a nervous flicker over his face before he slapped the armrest. "You question your king?" "I'm here to see what you're doing about it," she snapped, "and offer my services, such as they are, to the war effort." "War?" His face drained of colour. "What makes you believe we're going to war?" Gretchen blinked. "So you're handing us over, then?" "Of course not," he sputtered. "We are in negotiations as we speak." Gretchen held her fist to her hips, her mouth agape. "Negotiations? For the safe return of our money and restitution on account of the pain and suffering?" "Pain and—" He shook his head. "Perhaps we can come to some accord on what the villagers owe the crown next year." "I want a refund." Gretchen gritted her teeth. "A refund? You heard. We have a contract, you and me. I pay you to keep my land safe and fix the odd hole in the road. You've reneged." The king's face burned bright red in outrage, and he opened his mouth when the Baron of Greenhaven strode in from a side door and pointed straight at her. "Arrest her! She's in league with Nora Brightstar." Chapter 3. Gretchen tried to speak, but all that came out was a croak. The king flew out of his chair and bellowed for the guards. "In league with Nora Brightstar." "What do you mean, in league?" She pitched her voice loudly to be heard over the king's profanities. "Sure, we share the odd witch's brew and hang out at the same tavern, but—" "You're in contact with her, then?" The Baron stepped closer with a snarl. "A spy feeding extra information about our plans." "Extor? Is that where she is?" Gretchen ignored the guards tramping toward her. "Cook said she lost her marbles a few weeks ago." The Baron's eyes narrowed, seeking any hint of a lie. Then he turned to the king. "Perhaps we should question her first." The monarch had gotten himself into a flap and had unbuttoned his collar, heaving like a bull. His face remained stony, but he gave a tight nod. Guards grabbed Gretchen by her shoulders and hauled her to a bench, where they dropped her unceremoniously. Looking up, Gretchen could appreciate why they had the officials elevated on a stage. Looming over her like that, it was difficult for her to string a coherent thought together. "When did you last see Nora Brightstar?" The Baron stood on the edge of the dais, glaring down at her. Gretchen had to fight amusement at the notion that it was the only place from which he could look down at anyone. "Well," Gretchen puffed her cheeks out, "weeks ago. I've not had a lot of time to spend wallowing at the salt and bog. First I had to catch up on some orders, and then there was the baker with the boil on his... What do you know of her plans to betray the kingdom?" "Betray?" Gretchen wrinkled her nose. "That's ridiculous. She's the most patriotic person I know. Has every newspaper clipping from the royal wedding and a subscription to that rag the scribe of the realm puts out. What in tarnation is going on here?" "Treachery," the king growled. "A king gone mad and turning on his oldest friends?" Gretchen looked to the Baron for clarification, her face slack. "You really are a half-wit, aren't you?" He sighed. "King Rupert of Exeter put away his wife and married some maiden who appeared at his court. Nora is in her employ. The girl isn't seen anywhere without her. Now he's making mad claims of ownership over land that hasn't been in his family for centuries." Edwina was never a looker, but she did give him 3 strapping sons. The king had his head propped in his hand and stared at the far wall. His anger turned to gloom. "If I had anything to do with it, then why would I be here complaining about double taxes, HM?" Gretchen shrugged off the guard's hand and stood. "And what about saving your bacon with that Prince of Sharon? Nora could have turned tail and run, but instead we risked our necks to put things right." The Baron's glare turned mulish. "Saving her own reputation. For all we know, she was the witch behind that hex." "Now why would she?" Gretchen shook her head, deciding the argument was pointless. "Look, I've got a friend locked up over this mess, and I'm out of pocket 10 gold coins. Cook said something about a mirror. Let me go find out what's going on. This stinks of enchantment. A spy?" The king's brow furrowed. "I have people in Rupert's court already. No witches, I'll wager, and nobody who has an excuse to get close to Nora and this new queen." Gretchen clucked her tongue and glanced at the Baron. "This one's a troublemaker, Your Majesty. I wouldn't trust her as far as I could throw her." He folded his arms in front of him. "She has her uses." The king waved a hand, and the former scribe of the realm said she was harmless. "Former?" Gretchen let out a low whistle. "Did Mr. Smarty Pants get the old heave-ho? Can't say I blame you. Never thought much of his work, particularly after—" "A traitor." The king's eye flickered to the Baron, who likely didn't know about her part in the damsel gauntlet. "I sent him to gather intelligence and remind Rupert of our long years of friendship. Instead, we hear word that he writes sonnets in tribute to this harlot." Gretchen let the information filter through her mind, far too peculiar for a mid-kingship crisis. "Let me go to her. Get to the bottom of this whole debacle. If everything you say is legit, I swear I'll slip this woman a brew that will have her covered in warts. Thinks she can get away with extortion and kidnappings, does she? Well, she should have thought about who she was messing with." "Sire," the Baron warned, "let her go. Even if she's being deceitful, I can't see what harm she could do on their side." The king stood and turned, flicking his hand at the guards. "You should focus on what your diplomats are up to in Rupert's court." The Baron gave her one last lingering glare before turning and following the king back to the palace proper. Gretchen curled her lip and yapped like a dog at the guards behind her. "You heard him, Fido. Back to your kennels." Chortling to herself as she swept past them toward the door, she tried to piece together a plan of attack. She'd been zipping around on her broom all day, and she didn't fancy spending a night in the sky, even if it was clear and a full moon hung in the air. Perhaps she could while away the remaining hours of the day at the Swine and Claw, one of the less reputable establishments reserved for magical types, or go visit her sister at the academy. She picked up her pace in the palace square and kept her eye out for the hay wagon driver on the way to the busy streets, indecision plaguing her. The last person she wanted to see was her sister, but if she wanted to find out anything about this weird mirror of Nora's, the academy was a good place to start. Jürgen, she reminded herself. She couldn't in good conscience spend the night drinking her fill in a tavern while he remained imprisoned. Still, her lip curled as she strode up the steps to the academy, anticipating Cordelia's frosty reception and less than helpful lectures. That's if she deigned to see her at all. She knew there had to be some kind of reckoning with her sister after what she'd learned in the Tooth Fairy realm, but it would need to wait. As luck would have it, she recognised the young witch standing sentinel in the reception area and gave her a wide grin. "Hey, remember me? Cordelia Mirkwood's loving sister. Be a dear and let her know I've arrived, would you?" The girl's face blanched, and she turned to a wall of pipes used to carry messages throughout the academy. Gretchen smirked, wondering what Cordelia had said to the chit last time she'd dropped by. "The Vice-Chancellor will be down presently." The girl licked her lips and waved to a row of benches. "Please sit." Gretchen tipped her hat with a grin and wandered along the walls, inspecting the portraits of witches of prominence. She was sure they only hung them so high just so they could look down on everyone. After waiting around for a few minutes, her mind wandered to what pranks she could pull that would get her sister's attention a little quicker. "Gretchen." Gretchen turned, hands behind her back, as if she'd been caught in the act of some prank. Her sister had that effect on her. "What can I do for you?" Cordelia folded her hands in front of her and wore a stony expression, which had become a permanent fixture since she started her work at the academy. Gretchen gritted her teeth, wanting nothing more than to let rip on what she knew about the giant spiders and caves, but knew how that argument would end. Getting the bum's rush out the door didn't suit her purposes. "Yeah, nice to see you too," Gretchen snorted. "Like what you've done with the place." She swept an arm around the reception, which hadn't changed since Gretchen had been a pupil. Cordelia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Running a tongue across her teeth, she stood to her full height and nodded toward the staircase behind her. "Come along, then." Gretchen never understood why the bigwigs at the academy chose to have their offices at the very top of the building. With no way more efficient than the confounding staircases to climb, Gretchen began panting as they rounded the last landing and gripped the banister to heave her way up. Cordelia looked just as relaxed as she normally did, though Gretchen thought she saw the ghost of a smile across her lips as she held her office door open. "Now." She closed the door firmly behind her. "What's this all about? We both know you don't drop around just to visit." Gretchen slumped to one of the ladder-back chairs behind Cordelia's desk and rolled her head around in circles with a groan. "I've been zooming around all day. I'm on official business, from the Crown." Cordelia quirked an eyebrow but said nothing as she settled herself in her leather, upholstered chair. "I don't suppose you've heard about this border war, then?" "There have been rumours about some disputed lands." She narrowed her eyes. "But nothing about a border war." Gretchen recounted her morning with the tax collectors and her trip to the estate. "And when I got back to the tavern, he was gone. Poof, just like that. Arrested for not coughing up coin to those thugs. So I says to myself, this mirror." Cordelia leaned forward in her seat. "Did you get any more detail on the mirror?" "Not really." Gretchen rubbed her chin. "All I know is it took 2 men to get it down to her workroom, and that Nora went loopy after that." Cordelia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "You didn't think to ask?" "Well, I was talking to Cook, wasn't I? Unless I wanted to know how many eggs I could fry on it under a summer sun. I doubt she would have been that insightful. And what's this nonsense about the Crown?" Gretchen smothered a smug grin. Not that she was in a position to explain her acquaintance with their monarch. "Came to demand a refund on my taxes, see? That ditherer is sitting on his hands hoping to talk it out. The Baron was there in a wicked temper too, and says they should arrest me as a spy." She tapped her nose and winked. "But I convinced them I would be better placed to go as an emissary on their behalf to figure out what's going on." "An emissary?" Cordelia's eyebrow quirked. "Okay, so maybe nothing official. A volunteer spy of sorts on account of my relationship with Nora." "Right," Cordelia stood. "Agnes is the authority on mirrors in the academy. We must go to her at once." Gretchen followed her sister out of the office into the hallway. She hadn't expected getting much by the way of help, and stayed a few steps behind as Cordelia strode on through winding passages and lounges, where older witches sat poring over ordinary books. There was an uncomfortable prickle at the back of Gretchen's neck. She'd never felt at home in the academy, and she reminded herself why she was there. "Anyone seen Agnes?" Cordelia spoke with authority, and a huddle of much older witches blinked up at her in surprise. "The library, I think." One of them waved a hand at a nearby staircase. Cordelia gave a tight nod and led the way down. Gretchen suppressed a groan at the notion of more stairs. The library was in the lower levels of the academy, and trudged down behind her. "I hope you had the good sense to bring the key with you." Cordelia kept her eyes ahead. "The key?" Gretchen frowned. She took a moment to consider the question and barked a laugh. "You still haven't found it? I gave it to Aunt Esme for safekeeping." That earned her a glare from over Cordelia's shoulder, and Gretchen schooled her face to calm. Last time she'd borrowed the library key, she'd hidden it behind the portrait of their aunt on her way out. She'd presumed her sister had figured it out, since she hadn't sent a note asking about it. "Let me show you." As they continued, Gretchen got her bearings in the more utilitarian hallways, which were her stomping ground back in the day, and found the likeness hanging in a nondescript section of the academy. "I would have thought Aunt Esme deserved a more prominent position." She lifted the painting from the wall and retrieved the key, but I doubt she would have complained about being so close to the kitchens. Her sister looked as though she could chew rocks, but her eyes softened at the sentiment. No doubt she would have found it entertaining knowing where the key was all that time. "Come along." She turned to the more confounding part of their trip to the library. The circuitous route was only eased by the thought of Cordelia muddling along for months without her official key to the library, too proud to reach out to her sister and ask where it was, and too furious to concede that she'd been had by her prankster sister. As they turned the last corner into the stone hallway, Cordelia turned with narrowed eyes. "Be kind to Agnes, won't you? She doesn't get out much." Chapter 4. Mirrors are a portal to the soul. Agnes held a pocket mirror to the light, its reflection catching Gretchen square in the eye. There are many dangerous-looking glasses among the relics. Cordelia nodded sagely, and Gretchen's eyebrows furrowed. They'd had little sense from the ancient witch since they'd explained the situation. "What would be your best guess, given the lack of detail?" Cordelia's eyes flickered to Gretchen. "Hard to say," Agnes yawned. "A rogue soul, perhaps, or some kind of hex that triggers insanity. I'd need to get a good look at it to give a proper assessment." Gretchen knew where this was going, and her eyes widened. "No need to trouble yourself. I've got a hammer stashed in my pouch somewhere. If the mirror is behind all this mess, I'll put it right." No, Agnes held a finger up. "You mustn't shatter a magic mirror. That path only leads to doom. Your very soul could be bound to its magic." Gretchen puffed out her cheeks and slumped in her seat. "Well," a smile spread over Cordelia's lips. "The hour is late, Gretchen. Therefore I'll have a room prepared for you. I'll take this to the council immediately, and we will have an answer come morning." Gretchen rolled her eyes at Agnes, then stood with a groan, shuffling out of the library with a nod to Cordelia. "I'm not taking her with me." Gretchen folded her arms. "And I'll stay at the Swine and Claw." "Nonsense." Her sister stood and stared down at her. "This matter concerns all witchkind. If you mess this up and Nora goes unchecked, what do you think will happen to the academy? All of us will have a target on our backs." Gretchen ran a tongue over her teeth, regretting coming to Cordelia. If she had her way, it was likely they would send an entire entourage with her, but the tidbit about shattering the mirror was worth listening to, and if she snuck off... "I know what you're thinking," Cordelia planted her fists on her hips. "If you sneak off, I'll have your magic license revoked permanently." "You wouldn't," Gretchen gasped. "Your own sister?" The look on Cordelia's face said it all, and Gretchen sighed. They may have had a tense relationship, but Cordelia had fudged documents from time to time to keep her sister's license ticking over, probably because she thought Gretchen wasn't capable of doing much damage with her craft. "Fine, but I'm not flying to another kingdom with Agnes. I doubt she could fly much further than the city walls. I'll make a case to the council for the use of something more practical." Her lip twitched. "A portal stone should do the trick." Portal stone. Gretchen's belly churned at the words.
Last time she'd travelled with one of those, she'd ended up under a dragon's rear end. Nora was going to owe her one for this, maybe more like 2.
So, do I come to this council thingy? I think we both know it would be better if you didn't. Cordelia patted her shoulder and gave her braid a playful tug. Get some sleep, you've had a tough day. She strode off, leaving Gretchen to marvel at her sister's ability to say something insulting and consoling at the same time. The words on the note left by Nora niggled at her. A witch queen. She hoped this new chit who had captured King Rupert's attention and wasn't planning to hijack the throne herself. If it came down to the wire, she wasn't sure she could do anything that would put her friend in peril. Blinking, she stood, casting her eye around the well-lit room of wall-to-wall books. Designed to drown out the rest of the world, it was impossible to mark the time there. She could while away the hours trying to find an answer among the magical tomes stored on the shelves, or she could put her feet up and arrive in Exeter refreshed. Stifling a yawn, she stretched her arms overhead with a satisfying crack of joints. She always did work better grumpy. The index, which catalogued the spellbooks, stood on a gilded lectern up on a dais on the far wall. Her usual view of it was from below, while being bored to death at the yearly conferences, and she was more than a little surprised that her sister hadn't shown her out before leaving. Hoping the index was less belligerent than her spellbook at home, she climbed the steps and considered the right questions to ask. That was the trouble with keeping arcane secrets in enchanted objects. There was no means of fuzzy logic, and interpretation was in the eye of the whoever designed the enchantment. Running a tentative finger along the lectern frame, she cleared her throat and pushed away doubt. Spellbooks could sense doubt, like animals smelled fear. What does a witch queen have to do with an enchanted mirror? It was a long shot, but she couldn't come up with anything specific. Not a spellbook itself. The index page glowed and a neat scrawl formed on the page. Relevant volumes and their location in the library. South wall, second shelf from the right, 3 rows from the floor. Gretchen glanced up at the great compass painted in a fresco on the ceiling. She never understood by what method a room set apart from the outside world worked in its bearings. She wondered how long it took the Academy to realise witches don't carry compasses with them, and commissioned the artwork. But there were 3 books to pore through. It was a promising start. Never much of a scholar, Gretchen fetched the books down and scowled at them on the table. And there was where the trouble started. Untying the laces of the thickest tome, she held it down with one hand while fetching a notebook from her pouch. Now, pleasure to meet you and all that. Just seeing if you can help me with what a witch queen and a magic mirror have to do with one another. The book flipped open and stretched in front of her, as though waking from a long slumber. Gretchen rolled her eyes and tried again. Witch queens and magic mirrors, if you please. The page remained blank, and Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose. Come on, the index said you could help me. What about magic mirrors, then? Know anything about them? With a jolt, words appeared, and the book flipped its pages from front to back. The entire volume was full. Scrubbing a hand across her face, she pulled up the nearest stool and settled in for what would be hours of scribbling notes and hoping to find something. By the end of the tome, Gretchen swore she'd never look into another mirror again. Not that she was particularly vain anyhow. The only reference she could find to a queen was a case where a queen commissioned a magic mirror, which led to insanity. Reading between the lines, she wasn't sure if it had been designed that way, or if it was some kind of unintended consequence. The notation was centuries old, and it wasn't like she could ask its maker for clarification. Yawning, she blinked to focus her vision and retied the volume's laces. Not that it looked as though it would flap off on its own accord like her own spellbook. She heaved a deep breath as she considered the next 2 tomes, weighing the probability of finding anything useful. Gretchen, Cordelia stood by the door, looking slightly alarmed. You've been studying all night? Gretchen's eyes travelled around the room. The lighting looked the same as when she'd arrived. What time is it? Just past dawn. Cordelia strode over and frowned down at the books. You do realise you're taking an expert with you. If you put in this kind of effort while here as a pupil, you may have ended up with better prospects. Too tired to formulate a sharp remark, Gretchen stood to return the books back to their shelves. And how do you suppose I explain Agnes, then?
Nora always thought I was a terrible liar. A cousin, her sister said, a little too quickly, a little infirm, calling on her family to help move her things to the old witch's home. It'd explain her being so vague. Gretchen leaned over the table and stretched her neck from side to side. Is it true? The old witch's home? About her being a cousin.
Probably, if you looked far enough into the family tree. Cordelia beckoned to the door. Come along, the council wants a word. A word? Gretchen's head snapped up. I shouldn't talk to anyone without a cup of coffee first, not least those old... Wasn't my idea, she shrugged. Just keep your mouth shut and nod. We won't hold you up too long. Gretchen trudged along behind her sister and wiped at her grainy eyes. The portal stone was starting to sound like a good idea, so long as she didn't end up under Agnes's rear end. But gifts from the academy were never free of strings entirely, and if they thought this was some kind of field trip to collect a precious relic... Through here! Cordelia waved to a set of double doors, and Gretchen stopped short. In the basement? The older members of the council choose to keep their quarters on the same level, and we can't very well move the library, can we? With a new appreciation for why Cordelia kept her office at the top of the building, Gretchen rounded the corner, keeping her face carefully neutral. Morning sun peeked through overhead windows, and a fire crackled in a wide stone hearth. The council, such as they were, sat bundled in blankets around a haphazard semicircle of wingback chairs and sofas. Ah, a reedy voice called out. Gretchen focused on the witch closest to the fire, whose hair was thinner and face more wrinkled than the rest. Gretchen Mirkwood. Never thought this day would arrive. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at the woman, searching for some flicker of recognition. Just doing my part. Wise one. She stood with her hands grasped behind her back, trying to give off an air of confidence. A wheezy laugh brought it all back. Chancellor Marion Inglewood, an old woman even back in Gretchen's day at the academy. She could scarcely believe the old battle-axe was still breathing. This mess young Nora's gotten herself into is unacceptable. She cleared her throat. I never thought much about her position with the Baron either. Witches messing with politics only makes things political for the rest of us. A murmur came from the other council members, and Gretchen gave a nod. Your use here is to get Agnes close enough to establish what this mirror is about. She will make a proper assessment on whether transportation with the portal stone is safe. The objective is to get this mirror to the academy and minimise the damage done to our cause. Gretchen ground her teeth, her fists bunching behind her. Now my objective is to bust a friend out of jail, figure out what's going on with Nora, and get my money back from this Rupert fella. I thought you might say that. Her face cracked into a malevolent smile. Beryl, come here, would you? A younger witch scuttled into view from around the hearth holding a glowing stone. She didn't quite meet Gretchen's eye as she stood next to the wingback chair. The portal stone will only work for Beryl here. A good head on her shoulders, this one. And I've told her not to take any guff from you. Gretchen rolled her eyes and reached into her pouch for her broom. That's it. I'm out of here. I didn't do what you told me to when I was a kid. What makes you think I'd be any different now? She spun on her heel to march out the door and found herself frozen in place. The cackling behind her was only marred by the wheezing and the clicking of boot heels approaching. If she could have shrieked in outrage, she would, but her face remained frozen in a smug smile. I've been told you can be... stubborn. Beryl stood in front of her and cocked her head. But I'd like to think we can come to an understanding. Agnes? Gretchen watched from her periphery as the older witch shuffled forward and braced herself as Beryl reached out. It was lucky she hadn't eaten breakfast yet. Chapter 5. How long do you suppose before she thaws out? Agnes squinted at her in the gloom. Any minute now. Beryl was somewhere behind her, and the pair had only just returned to what Gretchen surmised was a basement somewhere in Extor. As she came into view, Gretchen promised herself to come up with a particularly creative prank to pay her back. I trust we won't have any trouble once the charm wears off. Her face was grave, though there was a flicker in her eye, as though she'd found the whole ordeal satisfying. I shouldn't like to do that in public. Doesn't give the right impression. Willing her face into a glare, all Gretchen managed was a spasm in her cheek.
She knew Beryl's type. A witch with ambition who would sell her own mother to please the council, much like her sister. She'd had enough time to consider the charm that bound her, and had concluded hours ago that Cordelia had a hand in fashioning it. Perhaps with a strand of hair while she was pretending concern over her lack of sleep. A low growl escaped her mouth as she dwelled on the duplicity of the academy. Rules for everyone else, but should they feel the need to break them, they did so unashamedly. Her knees wobbled, and all at once she collapsed in a heap on the floor. "You're going to regret you ever—" Beryl held a crystal up. "Let's not waste any more time, shall we?" It was her first mistake, revealing the crystal. Gretchen decided she could bide her time to take her out. "Well, I suppose you've been out there getting the lay of the land. What do you know?" With a cat-got-the-canary smile, Beryl settled herself on an accommodating barrel and folded her hands in her lap. "There's unrest out there. I'm from Exeter myself. Some are quite enthralled by the new queen. There are plays in the theatre in her honour. Others mutter in dark corners of taverns about the treachery against old Queen Edwina. Her second eldest, Luke, is rumoured to be gathering support for her release." Gretchen rubbed life into her legs and stood. "Can't say I care. Just point me in the direction of the dungeons. I need a proper sidekick, and Jurgen will be a lot less conspicuous than you two when I confront Nora." Beryl pressed her lips in a thin line and glanced at Agnes. "Our first priority is getting close to Nora." Gretchen dusted off her skirt. "That's the only reason the Academy saw fit to include me in this little scheme. Let me do my work and seek her out. After that, the mirror is yours. She's in the palace. I don't know how you plan on getting in there. We have missives from the Academy. That should get us through the door." Gretchen flashed her most belligerent smile. "I plan on taking the back door, through the dungeons." Agnes blinked at that and held up a finger, but Gretchen turned to stride toward the door. She'd never been to Exeter before and had no idea what part of the city she was in, but she was no stranger to being a public nuisance. Half surprised, Beryl didn't stop her. She opened a door at the top of a set of stairs and glanced down a wide hallway. It smelled like a seedy tavern, less the ale, and when she turned a corner, she stopped short at the sight in front of her. Cats twined their way between stuffed couches and chairs, while others curled up in lumpy blankets. Sitting around with vague stares were ancient women, some of them swaying to the time of a tune playing in the background. The old witch's home. Curling her lip, she backed away to what she hoped was the direction of the exit, and promised herself to end it before a place like that was necessary. If she kept up her usual risk-taking behaviour, it could be a lot earlier. Taking a sidestep around a younger witch who rounded the corner with a tea tray, she picked up her pace to avoid any questions. She spotted a hat stand by a door and made a beeline for it. When it opened to the odorous scent of city streets, Gretchen clucked her tongue and closed the door firmly behind her. A city was a city, and this one looked much as any other. Carts pushed along the winding roads, and she followed the flow of people toward the square where traders hawked their wares. As a trader herself, she took stock of the vendors and leaned against the booth of a bored-looking silk merchant to chat. "This queen crap is terrible for business, don't you think?" She smiled. It was a safe statement. Business was always bad, and merchants always blamed something for a lack of customers. "I don't know why I bother," the squat man threw up his hands. "Every day is the same. What of the colours the queen wears? Like they expect I can produce crimson silk at an affordable price." "I hear she's quite the looker. Can't say I've seen her." The man raised his eyebrows. "Then you must be living under a rock, witch. Parades herself around the city every day to win the hearts of the people. With skin that fair and hair that black, she must be some kind of sorceress." His eyes widened. "No offence." "None taken," she cackled. "Does she keep a witch in her employ? I've been looking for Nora Brightstar." The man blanched at that and backed away, holding his hands up. "I mean no offence. Please, you must believe me." Gretchen frowned. Nora was infamous for her hexes, but Gretchen had never seen anyone fearful of her. Cautious, perhaps. "Has she been by today? The queen, I mean." The merchant nodded, swallowing, and Gretchen tipped her hat and wandered off. She wasn't sure if the information had made things easier or harder. To spring Jurgen out of the dungeon,
She needed to get into the palace, but if she stood a chance of bumping into Nora in public, she may have to sit on her hands until she got the opportunity. Gretchen was never much good at sitting on her hands. Asking a passerby for directions to the courthouse, she pushed past the throng going about their business toward the looming castle. She stopped by a baker's cart for a couple of sweet buns and chewed them absently when she saw it. A poster on a brick wall. She didn't have to get close enough to read to know it was the work of the scribe of the realm, chief peddler of half-truths and making the top end of town look good. She stormed over to glare at the likeness of the Queen, with flowery words praising her beauty and elegance. With what she knew about the scribe, she wouldn't be surprised if the woman looked like a crone. There was no way she'd bust him out of this mess. Exeter was welcome to his quill-twirling backside. With a shake of her head, she strode on, reprimanding herself for not checking the Salt and Bog's lockbox when she'd left. She knew where Jurgen kept it stashed. There was a good chance it remained hidden, and wasn't sure she had enough coin to spring Jurgen out the regular way. She climbed the steps toward the courthouse outside the palace gates and ducked into the smaller door where a clerk sat behind a desk. "Name?" He didn't look up from his scribblings. "I'm here to inquire about a prisoner. Your name." His eyes flickered up. "We keep records of all known associates." Gretchen's eyes widened, and she scrambled for a name that would work. "Nina Thistlecrow. And your—" He looked her up and down. "Husband?" "Friend. Jurgen of Edgewater, publican at the Salt and Bog." "Edgewater?" He pressed his lips together. "Tax evasion, I take it." He was a little confused, is all. Gretchen smiled one of her sweetest smiles. We didn't get the memo about having a new monarch. The clerk gave a disinterested nod and reached for a ledger. "Understandable, I suppose. Lucky for your friend, the penalty this time round is a public flogging." He ran a finger down a list and his eyes widened. "Except it seems they have charged him with assaulting the king's men. 4 of them, if the records are accurate." He glanced up at the ceiling and mouthed what looked like numbers. "The sentence for that would be execution, but if you're here to pay his dues, the magistrate may be merciful and make it swift." Gretchen recoiled, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what was more disturbing, the impending verdict or that the clerk looked like he was discussing the bill over dinner. All because of a misunderstanding. Now, I don't know what this king thinks he's about, but if he wants the goodwill of his new citizens, then he should really consider putting his best foot forward. These kinds of punishments sound like they've come right out of the Dark Ages. "You wouldn't see—" "Enough, madam." The clerk held a finger up in warning. "'Tis an offence to speak out against our benevolent king." Gretchen stood calculating, wondering whether she should keep going to get locked up. It would save her some trouble getting into the dungeons, so long as she could bust her way out again. But if the root of the problem really was Nora's mirror, then there may be an easier way to settle the matter. "If you'll excuse me, I have to put a bouquet together for the funeral." Gretchen harumphed and turned on her heel. Back on the streets, she looked for the telltale signs of a messenger shop and found a painted sign of a courier mounted on a horse with winged hooves. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and a bell sounded over her head. "Morning." A woman in an ink-stained apron sat at a desk, making copies of missives laid in front of her. "I hope you don't need anything delivered to Helgard. New orders are that the Crown clear all messages there." "Something much more local." Gretchen moved a stack of papers from a stool and sat. "I need to get a message to the palace. Nora Brightstar. She's a witch in residence there." The woman rubbed her eye, leaving an inky smudge, and frowned at her. "You can't take it there yourself." "Weak knees, dear." Gretchen smiled. "And I'd be willing to pay you handsomely if you make it seem like it had travelled further than it has." "Ah." The woman's eyes darted to the door, and she leaned forward. "Just where did this note come from, then?" Gretchen pressed her lips together, calculating. "Let's say it came from Helgard but got held up for a few weeks. Lame horse or something." The woman's lip twitched, and she nodded. "I'll get you some parchment and a quill." If Gretchen was to lure Nora away from this queen, everything had to seem above board. The old witch's home would do nicely, and maybe if she mentioned something about a hex. "Here you are. When would you like it delivered?" "Today." Gretchen cleared her throat and took up the quill, unless that would be out of the ordinary. The woman only shrugged and returned to her own scribbling. Chewing her lip,
Gretchen rolled the quill between her fingers and searched for the right words. Heard you have new digs in Exeter. I'm heading there myself. I have a cousin in the old witch's home, newly befuddled with a bad case of warts. There might be a hex involved. Can you meet me there to take a look? G. Blowing on the ink, she slid the message to the woman and puffed out her cheeks. How much? 5 silver. I'll be risking a reprimand by carrying something from Helgard. Gretchen nodded and handed over an extra coin. For your trouble. Leaving the shop, Gretchen hoped fervently that Nora would take the bait. There was too much at stake, and she didn't have time to wait around with Jurgen's neck on the chopping block. Chapter 6. You'll wear a hole in the floor. Beryl glanced up from a reference book with a flat stare. It was you who came up with this plan. Gretchen stared out the darkened window and puffed out her cheeks. I thought she might have come by now. Tomorrow is a new day, and losing your nerve won't help matters. Beryl snapped the book closed and stood. If she doesn't come, we'll figure out something else. Gretchen went to open her mouth and thought better of it. Beryl wouldn't care that her friend was counting his last hours in a foreign land. And here she was, waiting around while she could be doing something useful. Don't think about going anywhere. Beryl looked her up and down. If I return to the academy empty-handed, I'll keep you frozen for a week. Gretchen watched the snooty witch glide out of the room and curled her lip. She had to be 10 years her junior and had the nerve to speak to her like that. Once Nora was put right, she'd dream up a hex that would keep her from sitting down for weeks. Don't let her get to you. Agnes kept her eyes on her embroidering, looking the part in a facility for geriatric witches. She's a rising star in the faculty, but take away those charms, and she can't so much as stir up a breeze. I should know. It was Muggins here who had to get her over the line for a diploma. Gretchen tucked that tidbit away, and her esteem for the old witch went up a notch. She never managed to get a diploma herself, but that had less to do with ability and more to do with an aversion to study. But sitting around all night was wasting valuable time, and I may have something that could be of use. Agnes sat her embroidering hoop in her lap and reached for the lumpy carpet bag of sewing supplies she insisted on lugging around. For your friend, you have ants in your pants. Perhaps seeing him will put you at ease. Agnes rummaged around and produced a flat disc of tortoiseshell. Pushing on a clever clasp, the lid snapped open, revealing a compact mirror inside. She proffered it with a smirk, and Gretchen's eyes widened as she held it up to get a good look at it. The surface was cloudy, like it had smeared grease over it, but she could tell the glass was of a fine quality, and she sensed the powerful enchantment inside. Well, I can see why you were sitting on this. I'm surprised the council would let it out of the academy's 4 walls. What they don't know can't hurt them, Agnes tittered. She pushed herself up with a groan and yawned. I'll be off to my bed. So long as we return that mirror safely, I won't say anything if your feet get a little itchy. Gretchen's mouth hung open as Agnes shuffled off, her mind reeling with the possibilities. If this thing could show her whatever she wanted, she could have Jurgen busted out of that dungeon and make it back to get some shut-eye. She sat on the edge of a wing-back chair and cradled the mirror in both hands. Show me Jurgen. A shadow formed over the mirror and swirled in circles. With a flash, a picture appeared, though in the dark it was hard to make out her friend's features. He was alone in a cell and lay curled on his side on a narrow pallet. If it weren't for the swelling, she would have thought the black eye was a trick of the light, and one of his fangs looked chipped. She winced at the sight of him, and did a mental tally of what healing brews she had in her infinity pouch inventory. The tricky part, though, was getting to him in the first place. Pursing her lips, she weighed the mirror in her palm. Can you show me the way in? The swirling took much longer this time, and Gretchen thought she may be out of luck. She was ready to snap the lip shut when the mirror flashed, with a picture of the room she was sitting in coming into focus. Frowning, she squinted at the image and startled when it lurched forward through the corridors of the witch's home. Out onto the street it went, and streamed past darkened laneways and through the market square. She saw the courthouse up ahead, but as they drew near, the mirror took a sharp right into a crowded tavern where a rowdy bunch hadn't yet set their cups aside. The mirror pushed through the crowd to the back of the room,
where two guards sat sharing some unheard joke, both looking well past their limit. Gretchen blinked and opened her mouth to ask how this was useful, but the image grew larger until she was staring at a set of keys dangling from a belt. Of course, she'd asked how to get in, not where it was. Thanking her lucky stars, she snapped the mirror case closed and slipped out into the night. Having given some thought to her plan along the quiet trip to the tavern, named the Queen's Guard incidentally, Gretchen dusted off a long-ignored charm from the recesses of her pouch. Witchery of that nature was strictly banned in lands where men were lawmakers, but so long as a gal got out before dawn, nobody was any the wiser. Not that she got up to those kinds of shenanigans. She smoothed a fine powder over her cheeks and felt the tingle of glamour do its work over her middle-aged features. Although she couldn't see it herself, she knew to the likes of the crowd in the tavern she was an irresistible morsel. There were debates in hushed whispers among witches on whether they appeared different to each person, or perhaps didn't look different at all, but enchanting nonetheless. Gretchen just hoped the powder had lost none of its potency. Pushing her shoulders back and thrusting her chin in the air, she marched into the tavern like she owned the place. Her view from outside hadn't accounted for the smell, and she tried not to imagine what filth she was walking through as she glided past unwashed men to the back of the room. She felt their eyes on her, and it suddenly wasn't as loud as when she'd arrived. She spotted her quarry sitting in the same booth the mirror had shown, and smiled as one of them glanced up from his mug. If he's prepared to put his wife aside and turn the kingdom upside down, I'll wager that little minx. The guard's companion gave him a sharp nudge with his elbow, and he frowned as he looked up. His eyes widened as they fell on Gretchen, and she gave her best imitation of a playful giggle. Good sirs, sorry to bother you while you aren't on duty, though Gretchen thought it was a 50-50 on whether they'd abandoned their posts. I have a personal problem, and well, it's just too embarrassing to take to the sheriff's office. Their mouths hung open, and they nodded dumbly, so Gretchen scooched in next to the one with the keys. Oh, you'll probably think it's silly, but I'm just too frightened to stay home all alone, Gretchen bit her lip. Not after my underthings went missing from the line. Underthings? The guard across from her leaned closer. Oh, it's not that I want them back. I mean, sure, they had a small fortune in lace stitched into them, but I can't bear to think of what this creep is doing with them. Gretchen wiped an imaginary tear from her eye and turned to bury her head in the shoulder of the guard next to her. He patted her back as she sobbed, and she used the opportunity to pluck the keyring from his belt. When she sat up again with a dainty sniff, both sat a little straighter, with a gleam in their eye at her plight. We'll come over at once. Can't have a lady such as yourself lying in terror in her bedchamber. Why, we can stand right out the door, if that— Of course, Gretchen tittered. Only, can you go ahead to make sure the coast is clear? The sight of blood makes me rather queasy, and I have a dreadful feeling about this business. The guard clapped her shoulder in reassurance, and she gave a fake address, vague given her lack of familiarity with the city. Once you see the green sign, it's the second door on the right. She watched her troopers abandon their half-full mugs and stride with purpose out of the tavern and helped herself to a sip. As much as that little charm had its uses, it always left her with a feeling of revulsion that was hard to shake off. Her skin crawled at the feeling of a room full of eyes on her, and she made for the door. She was almost at the threshold when a hand gripped her elbow, and she swung around to a man leering over her, alcohol heavy on his breath. Can't have a pretty poppet like you walking the streets alone at this hour. He leaned in a little closer. Why don't you let me accompany you home? There was always a mean one in the bunch. Curling her lip, Gretchen muttered a dispelling incantation and grinned as he recoiled. I'll do just fine, thanks. Wrenching her arm free, she slipped out of the tavern and fished out the mirror from her pouch. She ducked into a small alleyway to keep out of sight and snapped the lid open. What's next? The mirror was quicker on the uptake that time, and she held a hand over the glass as it flashed. Turning so she could see the reflection and avoid notice, the viewpoint changed, and once again the reflection showed the path ahead of her. She watched as it moved ahead onto the street and pursed her lips as it dawdled toward the palace. But instead of going past the iron gates, it veered toward the back of the courthouse. Frowning,
Gretchen studied the image as it passed through a reinforced door and down a set of stone steps. Of course. Gretchen hadn't considered the route the condemned would travel once convicted for their crimes. Probably quieter that way too. Down the bottom of the stairs, a sturdy iron gate stood in front of a long tunnel, and the mirror picked up speed. A fairly straight path seemed to burrow deeper into the ground, and at its end another gate stood, as insurance on the first. Beyond that were stone steps leading up, and dark stone corridors with doors at regular intervals. Cells, most likely. Gretchen counted as the mirror moved forward, and it came to a stop on the 11th. Gretchen snapped the lid of the mirror closed and rubbed her hands together against the night's chill. Well, she muttered, now's as good a time as any, I suppose. Although the night was quiet, Gretchen trod the path to the courthouse with a spring to her step that had nothing to do with eagerness. Reminding herself not to run, she drew a deep breath as she covered the ground across the well-lit street and slipped into the laneway down the side of the stone building. In the shadows, barrels of refuse looked like waiting assailants, and a flurry of movement on the ground made her jump almost out of her skin. Rats. They were why she preferred to live in the countryside. It didn't take her long to figure out which key belonged in the first door, and she shut it softly behind her. In the absolute darkness, she drew out a light charm and wondered at how the mirror could illuminate dark places. She reminded herself to get in Agnes's good books, so she could borrow the mirror from time to time. With the light charm tied to her pointed hat, she descended the stone steps, reassured by the darkness ahead. She just hoped that if a torch came into view, it was her who saw it first, and not those on the other side. The first gate squealed on its hinges as it swung open, and Gretchen winced, making a note to oil the next set before trying to open them. With a muttered prayer to keep from getting arrested, she hiked up her skirts and set off at a jog along the damp tunnel. By the time she got to the next set of gates, Gretchen had reminded herself on 3 occasions she needed to get more exercise. Bending over with her hands on her knees, she took a minute to catch her breath, reckoning that if anyone was on guard up the stairs, they would have heard her ragged gasps by now anyway. She checked herself before unlocking the gate and fetched out a jar of grease to take care of the hinges. More than a few people thought she'd gotten the hoarding tendencies from her great-aunt Esme, but coupled with an infinity pouch, keeping a diverse range of supplies had put her in good stead. She was sure she held her breath until she had the gate clicked shut gently behind her, and took a moment at the bottom of the stairs to settle her pounding heart. With a small glass vial clasped in her sweaty palm, she took the first step up into the dungeon. Chapter 7. Every shadow was sinister, every smell offensive, but Gretchen slipped up the stairs and down the corridor unnoticed, though she wondered how they couldn't hear her heart pounding. Her light was muted now, barely glowing, but she still feared rousing the prisoners who were too anxious to sleep. She counted the doors as she passed each cell, but her mind alternated between 10 and 11. She should have noted it down, and with the flash of the mirror she didn't dare seek clarification. Iron grills were set in each door, but too high for Gretchen to see through. Muted sounds of snoring and weeping came from the cracks under the doors, and Gretchen pressed her ears against the 10th door, hoping to hear something familiar. The faint rumbling decided her. Jürgen had many annoying habits, but snoring wasn't one of them. Carefully fondling the keys to avoid the metallic jangling, she plucked the one she hoped was the most likely candidate from the ring and slid it in the 11th door. The barrel turned, and Gretchen thanked her lucky stars as she eased the door open. He looked much the same as the mirror had shown earlier, and hadn't roused at her intrusion. Alarmed, she kneeled at his bedside and held a hand to his cheek. The swelling around his eye was ugly, and tufts of his hair were matted with blood. He'd clearly taken a beating to the head, and she knew from having treated his injuries before that he was resistant to magical brews. Only the more mediocre medicines seemed to work. Nora always said trolls were mostly immune to magic. She'd already given some thought to the swelling and fetched out a tincture heavy on the turmeric. Added to that was a bone-knitting brew, a vitality potion, and liquid stitches. It may have been a waste of time, but if they did a minimal amount of good, She would call it a win. She rolled him over to pour the mix down his gullet and massaged his neck to ease it down. He didn't stir, and Gretchen unashamedly checked him over for superficial injuries. By the time she'd applied salve, bandages, and a couple of ordinary stitches, concern was gnawing at her belly about his unconscious state. "Come on, big guy," she whispered in his ear. "If I'm going to spring you out of here, I'll need you on your feet." There was a faint rumble in Jürgen's throat, and his eyelids twitched, but no other sign he was coming around. Gretchen heaved a deep breath and dropped her head to his chest. If she stood any chance of getting him out unnoticed, she'd have to come up with something more creative than usual. Nora, sleeping somewhere in the levels above the dungeons. There was no way she'd stand for Jürgen's execution, and if she was the Queen's right-hand witch. She fetched out the mirror and snapped it open. "How do I get to Nora?" Seconds dragged as the smoky cloud swirled, and Gretchen gave it a little shake. When the glass cleared, she stared at her own reflection, struck dumb. "Come on now," she hissed. "You can bust me into a dungeon, but not the palace." The remark elicited no reaction, and Gretchen's thoughts turned to Nora's mirror. Perhaps the enchanted object was shielding her somehow, or the mirrors were so alike as to counteract each other. From what she had read in the library, they seemed a very specialized school of sorcery. Dropping the mirror back in her pouch, she dug deep into her inventory, feeling around for something that may be of use. She grasped a small bottle, one she had been experimenting with a few weeks back. After messing around with an enlarging potion, she'd got to thinking about shrinking ones. She'd promised herself to only test it in dire circumstances, but she could think of nothing offhand that seemed less grim. The only question was who and how. Shrinking herself to scout the palace was a dicey proposition, and if apprehended, Jürgen would be doomed. But it may not even work on Jürgen, and she couldn't think of anything else she had on hand that could rouse him. In the gloom, he looked so vulnerable, a different creature to the one she knew could crack a skull and not break a sweat. She couldn't leave him there. There was a twinge in her belly of almost a maternal nature for the troll she had accidentally enchanted. And if the potion didn't work, she was prepared to stick around until he woke. She gave him one last vigorous shake to be sure he couldn't be roused, then thumbed the cork from the potion. Holding his nose, she tipped the vial into his mouth and muttered an incantation, hoping it would hasten the effects. He swallowed on his own this time, and Gretchen's eyes strained as she stared, waiting for something to happen. "For the love of all things good, Jürgen. Think small, you ugly beast. Tiny. If I can't smuggle you out in my pouch, they will slaughter you." Gretchen gripped his hand, and he gave the slightest of squeezes. His eyelids flickered again, and he shrank slowly. "That's it, big fella. You're getting the idea. Keep going now. I don't know how long I'll be able to lug a half-sized troll around on my back." The process was excruciatingly drawn out, but eventually Gretchen cupped the sleeping and naked troll in 2 hands. Getting him into her pouch would still be a squeeze, but at least she didn't have to rig up a sling. Hoping morning was still a few hours away yet, she slipped out of the cell and back down the darkened corridors. She only had to stop once on the trip back, when she heard voices in an adjacent passage. Pressing herself into a small alcove, she waited until they passed. The tunnel was still abandoned, and the courthouse quiet, except for the chatter of pre-dawn birdsong from outside. Once in the laneway, she leaned against the courthouse walls and drew long, ragged gasps. She didn't dare linger, though, and hustled back to the old witch's home, praying that the spell didn't wear off too soon. Jürgen may just prefer to be dead than live inside her infinity pouch for the rest of his days. When she clicked the front door softly behind her, she turned to find herself nose to nose with a livid-looking Beryl. "I should freeze you where you stand." "But you won't, will you?" Gretchen planted her most sardonic smile on her face. "We have a busy day today, and you won't get brownie points from the council if you keep them too long on this little expedition." "Where were you?" She looked Gretchen up and down with a scowl. "Oh, you know." Gretchen pushed past her with a swagger. "Just busting into the dungeon to rescue a wrongfully convicted troll." She moved into the small sitting room that Beryl had appropriated from the nurses and sank onto the lumpy sofa with a sigh. "Now, if you don't mind, I've a patient to tend to." Beryl remained by the doorway, and Gretchen shrugged before unhooking her pouch. She set it down on the coffee table and undid the laces, then reached deep for her friend, who she stashed by her bundles of bandages to keep him comfortable. She risked a glance at Beryl, whose eyes boggled at the sight of Gretchen shoulder deep in the infinity pouch, and drew Jurgen out carefully, mindful she didn't want to add any injuries to his impressive collection. "How did you—" Beryl leaned forward to stare intently at the troll, but didn't step any closer. "Oh, that old potion," Gretchen clucked. "Just something I had lying around in my trusty pouch. Us Mirkwoods are from a very old, magical family, dear. We have all kinds of obscure magic lurking around in our spellbooks. As for getting him out, well, can't give away all my secrets now, can I?" Gretchen didn't bother looking at Beryl. Instead, she studied Jurgen sprawled out on a cushion. He looked no bigger or smaller than she'd left him, and his swelling had improved a little. She gave him a tickle to the belly and grinned when he groaned and rolled over. "Excellent. He's on the mend. Morning." Agnes shuffled into the living room in a fluffy robe holding a mug of tea. "Didn't pick you for an early bird, Beryl. Now what do we have here?" "Jurgen, publican of the Salt and Bog in Edgewater." Gretchen gave Agnes a crooked smile. "Though he's usually a little bigger and noisier." "Interesting." Agnes took a sip of tea. "Will he take long to, get back to normal?" "She's compromised our position." Beryl's voice was shrill. Even now the guards could be looking for her. This wasn't part of the plan, and— "Hush now. I'm sure Gretchen here took precautions, and it's not like she was off having a good time. A good deed is a good deed in my book." With a huff, Beryl turned on her heel and stormed off down the hall. "Thanks for the mirror." Gretchen fished it out and proffered it, "though I don't think it will help much with our other problem." "I suspect not," Agnes nodded. "Mirrors can be fickle like that, and I'll wager Nora's is the more powerful of the pair." Gretchen stared at Jurgen, who twitched in his sleep. She'd picked Agnes for the vague sort, but now she had her pegged for an especially clever witch. "What's your best guess on what we're up against?" Agnes sank onto a wingback chair and propped her feet up. "Well, I can't say for certain, as I'm sure you'll understand, but I believe there may be a malevolent spirit in that mirror that has pressed Nora into service." "And the Queen?" "Who knows? A manifestation. Some poor girl with puppet strings attached to her. Could even be some kind of possession." Gretchen mulled it over and puffed out her cheeks. And how would one fix those kinds of problems? Agnes yawned and rubbed her eyes, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. Breaking the mirror would be the simplest solution, but I wouldn't advise that course of action. There would be some kind of defensive mechanism in place. Dispelling the compulsion holding Nora would be more prudent. Gretchen considered the likelihood of going toe-to-toe with Nora and taking her down. She didn't like her chances. She brushed a finger over Jurgen's forehead to check his temperature, and his eyes flickered open. "What the—" He took a swipe at Gretchen's hand and sat up with a snarl. "What have you done this time, Gretchen Mirkwood?" He screwed up his face and held a hand to his swollen eye. "Way to treat your knight in shining armour?" Gretchen harumphed. "Just risked my neck to haul your backside out of a dungeon is all." He blinked. Then his brows furrowed as he tried to reckon with his surroundings. "The tax collectors." "That's right," Gretchen rapped her head. "Gave you quite the going over. The penalty for assaulting 4 of the king's men was execution, so I think you owe me a generous tab when we get back home." Jurgen couldn't have been that concussed, Gretchen reasoned, by the filthy look he gave her. "The small part should wear off. You know the deal. Same as what happened to Rapunzel, only smaller." He shuffled so he could lean back against the sofa, holding his hands to his groin, and startled when he saw Agnes. "Who's she?" "You don't see an enchanted troll every day." Agnes pressed her lips together. "And how you got a potion to work on it, I'll never know." "We ready?" Beryl stood at the door with a haughty look on her face. "Or did you forget about our real purpose here?" Gretchen glanced out the window where the streets were brightening and the first sounds of industry were starting. "I don't think she'll be out just yet. From what I've heard, queens like to sleep in." "These public addresses are popular." Beryl eyed Jurgen askance. "I want a front row seat." Gretchen turned to Jurgen with a shrug and patted her knees. "Time for explanations later, I guess. How about I get you into a bed and give you a dose of something to get some shut-eye? Just need to free Nora from a magic mirror and get my tax money back. You're not leaving me here. He cast around the room. Where is here exactly? Gretchen snorted. Just the old witch's home. If you don't want to go to bed, I could send you out to their recreation room. I'm sure they'll think you're just adorable. After much protesting, Gretchen convinced the troll to get some rest and set him up in her own untouched room. She had just enough time to gulp down a lukewarm cup of tea before Beryl herded her out the door and took a tiny sip of a wakefulness brew while the other two weren't watching. It was considered poor form among witches to take self-enhancers, and for good reason too. It was a slippery slope, which normally ended hanging from the ceiling, rocking back and forth. Beyond the market square was the theatre, a flamboyantly painted building that stood separate to its neighbours. Coloured drapes hung from the balcony on the upper levels, where public performances took place. Already a flock of sycophants milled around sharing excited whispers. Gretchen perked up at the sight of a row of benches and settled in up front with a sigh.
Okay, so game plan. Gretchen directed it at Agnes, much to Beryl's annoyance. We wait around until this queen flounces in to give her daily pep talk to the crowd. From there, Nora should head over to the witch's home to see me while she's in the city. If she doesn't, Gretchen held up a finger, I'll intercept her. But remember, though, you're my dear cousin Agnes, who's been newly transferred to the witch's home, befuddled before her time, with a bad case of warts. And me? Beryl quirked an eyebrow. Her dullard daughter, Gretchen huffed, who was so upset and confused, had a message sent to fetch me. Sounds plausible, Beryl muttered as she crossed her arms. We need to get into her workroom, wherever that is. If Nora's so captivated by this mirror, she would keep it close to her magical equipment. She's not just good at hexes, you know. I've run afoul of more than a few of her booby traps over the years. That earned a snicker from both of the witches, and Gretchen rolled her eyes. They settled to silence, and Gretchen's mind turned to the woman in the centre of all this calamity. A woman truly capable of turning a kingdom on its head must be a powerful sorceress, and one with the strength to turn Nora into an instrument would be more formidable again. A witch queen was what Nora thought she was getting herself into, and Gretchen wondered if the concept was all that terrible. They may even end up with equitable rights one day if she conquered the continent. She was lost in her own musings when Beryl gave her a sharp nudge with her elbow. The queen, with impossibly white skin and inky black hair, approached with her entourage. Just one step behind were Nora and the scribe of the realm, standing shoulder to shoulder. Chapter 8. The stuff that spewed from the queen's mouth as she gave her address were the ravings of a zealot. Her eyes blazed as she roused the crowd with ranting over perceived slights and wrongdoings over the land of Extor, but she promised another way, one of conquest and making their kingdom a force to be reckoned with. The Extor people at the pinnacle of a new society. Nora stood behind the folds of the queen's crimson dress, nodding at each of her statements. She's bonkers, Gretchen whispered to Agnes. Maybe we ought to go back to the witch's home to rustle up some lucidity potions. Beryl hissed at her to be quiet, and Gretchen drew a deep breath through her nose. She wasn't sure how much more drivel she could listen to, and had a mind to stand up and say her piece. Her eyes drifted to Nora, though, and she ground her teeth as she willed herself to stay silent. I must thank each and every one of you for your support. The Queen waved a hand across the courtyard. Without you, I would still be under the cruel confines that wicked Queen Edwina had me under. The good scribe of Extor is penning my memoir, and he shall reveal the truth to you better than I ever could. The scribe gave a smarmy smile and waved to the cheering crowd. With a promise to herself to give a blow-by-blow account of his treason to King Edgar, Gretchen clapped at the nudge from Beryl. The Queen's party withdrew from the balcony, and the guards by the door shuffled in readiness to clear the path for them. The onlookers didn't budge, instead pressing toward the door to get an up-close encounter with their monarch. Gretchen was having second thoughts on whether Nora would take her leave from there, and nodded toward the doors. Come on, once they're out, these nutjobs will be squealing and trying to climb over the guards. Elbowing her way past those in the crowd who had the same idea, she winced as a heel came down on her toe. She bared her teeth at a woman who looked as though she would trip Agnes,
and wedged herself into a space with an unfortunate proximity to a guard's armpit. Muttering about the time it took to get down a set of stairs, she craned her head to get a glimpse through the door. Nora was busy arranging the Queen's skirts, much to Gretchen's disgust, and the scribe patted the monarch's hand with what looked like encouraging words. The Queen stood with her nose turned up in the air, and when she took her first step into the daylight, flashed a bright smile absent just a second earlier.
"Nora!"
Gretchen called. As the party stepped past and the crowd's sounds grew, she bellowed,
"Nora Brightstar!"
Her head jerked at that, and Gretchen waved as Nora scanned the people pressed against the wall of guards. When her eyes fell on her, she frowned as though trying to place her face. The Queen paused and turned to watch as Nora shuffled forward, waving the guard in front of Gretchen aside. "Can I help you?" "Nora." Gretchen screwed up her face. "It's Gretchen, you nitwit. Didn't you get my note?" "Gretchen," she nodded, though she still seemed vague. "What note?" "I need your help on a hexing matter." Gretchen turned and swatted the guard away to haul Agnes through. "This is my second cousin, Agnes. They say it's a case of befuddlement, but it doesn't seem right to me. Befuddlement doesn't come with warts." Nora leaned closer and sniffed the air. "Can't smell a hex on her. Sometimes these things just happen prematurely. Listen, can we just have a proper conversation?" Gretchen jerked her thumb at the crowd. "Away from these morons? You'd think after all these years you'd have a pot of tea for an old friend." The Queen stepped closer, an indulgent smile on her face. "Your friends, Nora? I'm needed at the palace. If they need your help, do bring them along." Her eyes glittered as she considered Gretchen and her companions. "We never turn a witch in need away, do we?" Nora nodded vigorously, and the Queen swept ahead. The scribe curled his lip at Gretchen, and she flashed her toothiest grin as she hauled Beryl and Agnes in behind Nora. As the procession took off again, Gretchen worried at her lukewarm reception and lack of recognition. It wasn't the Nora she knew. Annoyingly, the crowd moved with them toward the gates to the palace, and the Queen made small stops to clasp hands and hand over coins. Garnering support, indeed. Beryl, at least, kept her trap shut, and when the guards swung the gates shut behind them, Gretchen felt like she could breathe again. It surprised Gretchen when Nora continued to follow the Queen into the palace proper and ascended the stairs toward the royal apartments. The scribe departed on the first level with a kiss to the Queen's hand and a circumspect look thrown their way, and the Queen gave a delicate sigh as she trailed into her rooms. Gretchen's eyes locked on a carved standing mirror in the apartment's corner, and silently cursed. It figured the Queen would keep it close. The new monarch dropped onto a velvet sofa, fanning her face, and closed her eyes for a moment before considering them. "Now, what seems to be the trouble, ladies?" Gretchen looked between the Queen and Nora, who still seemed vague. She cleared her throat and stepped forward. I beg the services of Nora, here to take a look at my cousin Agnes." She jerked a thumb over her shoulder. "I don't mean to trouble you. Witch business is all." The Queen laughed and waved a hand, leaving Gretchen with a sour feeling. She hoped their entire meeting wouldn't be chaperoned. "Of course, I have some abilities myself. I must assure you, in the new world my husband will forge, they will show witches proper respect and position. I welcome all of you to my cause." There was a certain lilting to her voice, and Gretchen thought she saw a flicker from the corner of her eye where the mirror stood, but her thoughts seemed clouded, and she shook her head. "Of course. Very kind of you. I always said—" The doors to the apartment burst open, and a rake of a man swept in. Even in a green silk robe he seemed unkempt, and his eyes were glassy even with the stupid grin on his face. "Darling, come, I must show you something." Annoyance flickered over the Queen's features before she stood with a warm smile. "Of course." She smoothed her skirts and glanced at Gretchen. "I'll have tea sent up. Do stick around." Gretchen blinked at the clouds swirling around her mind and nodded absently. When the door clicked shut behind them, the four witches stood silent for a few moments. Gretchen rubbed her temples, straining to recall their purpose, and why she shouldn't trust the warmth spreading through her thoughts. It was Nora's vague stare that snapped her back to attention, and she clicked her fingers across Nora's line of sight. "Nora Brightstar,
What in tarnation is going on here, looking at me like I'm some kind of stranger? Gretchen huffed. After all the years we've been friends. Nora frowned and blinked a few times before responding. Acquaintances. From years ago. Gretchen shot an imploring look at Beryl and Agnes. With an incoherent babble, Agnes shuffled forward with a hand reached toward the mirror. Don't you touch that! Nora took a step toward her and Gretchen caught her arm. She's harmless. Completely bonkers. Gretchen sidled round to stand between them. Now this hex. She had an enemy of sorts, and after seeing her in the market square, she came home completely changed. Gretchen shifted from foot to keep Nora from seeing past her. Nora ignored her and pushed past. That is royal property. Get your hands off it before I call the guards. Agnes hissed and stepped back, and as she turned, gave Beryl a barely perceptible nod. Beryl reached into her pocket, and before they could take off with the mirror, Gretchen shoved Nora forward to collide with them. Beryl got a hand on the mirror, and the portal stone glowed a brilliant blue. Nora barely had enough time to shriek before the world around them dissolved, propelling them through the space in between. Even in the void, Gretchen fancied hearing a pained scream from the Queen. After being pushed and pulled, and knocking her head on the mirror's stand, Gretchen fell in a heap. They lay sprawled in a darkened room that smelled of bare earth and dust. She cast around frantically, searching for the welcome party at the academy, and saw only the basement of the old witch's home. The mirror is resisting, Agnes groaned. It won't travel far from its master. Nora crawled from under the mirror and ran reverent fingers over the glass. With a growl, she turned, and Gretchen could feel sinister magic gathering around her. Quick! Gretchen screeched. Freeze her! Beryl stood, her mouth working, rigid as she pressed her back against the wall. Gretchen swung her gaze around in time to register raw magic headed her way and leaped out of the way into a stack of crates. Jürgen, Gretchen hollered. If you're awake, it would be a good time to get your rear end down here. She scuttled out of the way as fire sparked at the top of the crates and moved to the dusty recesses of the room. Hoping fervently that there were no magical items to ignite down there, she clambered over a set of cane chairs and peeked through to assess the situation. She couldn't spot Agnes, but Nora had rounded on Beryl and was approaching her with bunched fists. Unleashing raw magic was more than unlawful. It was utterly insane. It was as likely to cause one's own demise, let alone anyone else's. Beryl remained standing like a stunned rabbit, and Gretchen cursed the witch's lack of survival instincts. As tempting as it was to let her perish, Gretchen pushed over the stack of chairs and launched toward the pair. Nora turned with bared teeth, and Gretchen took a sidestep to avoid a bright steam of magic. She registered the smell of smoke before launching at her enraged friend to tackle her to the ground. What's going on down here? Jürgen called out from the top of the stairs. Gretchen poked Nora in the eye, even as they rolled over one another. The mirror, Jürgen! Smash the darn mirror! Nora screeched at that and pushed Gretchen off, scrambling to get to her feet. Don't break the mirror! Agnes called out. It could destroy us all. Shut up, Agnes! Gretchen grabbed a handful of Nora's skirts and hauled her backward. Come on, Jürgen, it has to be you. Nora landed on top of Gretchen, knocking the wind from her lungs. Turning with a snarl, she gripped Gretchen's neck, leaning forward until they were nose to nose. Gretchen could sense Nora drawing magic to herself, and squeaked with what air remained, convinced they'd both be incinerated before Jürgen made it. The sound of glass breaking was the sweetest thing she ever heard. Nora flung her head back and toppled, writhing on the floor, and Gretchen swallowed painfully. The room filled with smoke, and she held a sleeve to her nose as she pushed to her feet. She heard Agnes's mutterings and felt a cool breeze as the smoke dissipated, dampening the flames on the burning crates. What just happened? Jürgen held his head with a wince. Seeing him the right size filled Gretchen with relief, and she crossed over to where shards of glass littered the floor at his feet. She stopped short at a flash of movement across the shattered pieces and held a hand to her chest as she bent closer. A withered face moved behind the remains, and as it opened its mouth to shriek, there was a ringing in Gretchen's ears. Although ancient, she recognized the Queen's face, and she brought her boot heel down on a larger fragment with a crunch. Careful now. Agnes caught her elbow and wrenched her back. It might be broken, but there's still plenty of magic left.
She turned to Nora, who was yowling on the floor, raking fingernails over her face. "Be quiet, you!" Nora's moans turned to pathetic sobs, and Gretchen's own face threatened to crumple. Will she be okay? Compulsion magic leaves dreadful withdrawals once severed. Agnes patted her shoulder. She'll come good. Just give her time. Is anyone going to tell me what's going on? Jurgen growled. That mirror is possessed and had its claws in Nora. Gretchen sniffed and pursed her lips at the troll. I knew there was a good chance it wouldn't harm you. It's hard work getting magic into that noggin of yours. A good chance? He quirked an eyebrow. Well, I did say you owed me one. Gretchen's eyes flickered to Beryl, who hadn't moved. You okay? She swallowed as she stared at the ruined mirror. I couldn't have frozen her, even if I wanted to. That charm was for, you specifically. Thought as much. Gretchen clapped her hands and rubbed them together. So where do we find a dustpan and broom around here? I don't like the chances of getting my gold back, but I'd say this is pretty close to mission accomplished.
Gretchen scrubbed a hand over her face and groaned. I told you this already. Jurgen smashed the mirror. I was too busy having the life choked out of me to notice what he used. Cordelia's eyes narrowed, her fingers steepled under her chin. Where did you meet this enchanted troll anyway? Nobody on the entire council has ever heard of one. Which was precisely why Gretchen had ushered him out the minute they landed in the portal room of the academy. She rubbed her eyes, trying to remember how long she'd gone without sleep, then shook her head with a sigh. At a bar for magical types, she lied. We were in need of a publican for the Salt and Bog, and he seemed to know one end of a keg from the other. Foreign-sounding name, though. Thought maybe he was some kind of backpacker. Cordelia's lip curled with distaste at the mention of the Salt and Bog, and Gretchen hoped it was enough to get her off the hook. If the academy learned she'd accidentally enchanted the troll herself, they'd have her pinned on a corkboard in the name of research for the next few decades. We should like to speak to him. Cordelia waved at the quill making notes, causing it to drop. For the records, of course. I'll let him know, Gretchen smiled through gritted teeth. Can I go see Nora now? Impossible, I'm afraid. Cordelia stood wearing a guarded look. We have delivered her to the Baron's custody. She's what? Gretchen flew off her chair and planted her fists on her sister's desk. In her condition? Of all the callous things this wretched academy has done, this really takes the cake. I should never. Cordelia held up a hand, and for the first time in years, Gretchen saw a wariness in her eye. He's made assurances she will come to no harm, and is in the palace resting. We have one of our own watching over her to ensure she improves. It was the only way to stop the king's guards breaking our door down. Gretchen glared at her sister, her face a rictus of fury, but as the seconds dragged on, she saw the truth in those words. Not that she didn't also suspect Nora's keeper was more of a guard than a nurse. This wasn't her fault, which is why... Cordelia waved at the stack of paper on her desk. We must present a full account of the facts to the king. Agnes is busy examining what is left of that mirror to determine its root enchantment. What will happen to her? Gretchen chewed her lip and blinked away unbidden tears. Nora, I mean. Cordelia's eyes softened and her shoulders slumped. We shall have to see how this all plays out politically. We've had word that the Queen in Exeter has disappeared and King Rupert is nursing a mighty headache. We shall advocate for the course of action that most effectively sweeps this under the rug. Gretchen winced at the mention of politics and hoped Cordelia knew what she was doing. Two kings with an acute case of battered pride didn't sound promising for her friend. Resolving to do what she could to avert any injustices, she spun on her heel toward the door. As she was about to step out into the hallway, Cordelia called out, Gretchen! Gretchen turned to her sister with a frown. Where are you off to? The palace, Gretchen said, like it was obvious. If those knuckleheads get any ideas, I'll remind them who got them out of this pickle. Cordelia's mouth twisted into a wry smile, and Gretchen couldn't remember the last time her sister had found anything she said amusing. Nora has a good friend. See to it you don't mess this up for her, will you? Thank you for joining me on this magical journey through Psycho Mirror, Episode 5 of the Gretchen's Misadventures series. If you've been captivated by Gretchen's escapades, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more enchanting readings and fantastical tales. Share your thoughts on this mystical misadventure or recommend your favourite fantasy reads in the comments below. Your insights are the magic that keeps this community thriving. If you're ready for more of Gretchen and her magical escapades, give this video a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all things magical. Until our next adventure, may your books be filled with wonder and your days with magic. Happy reading.